what is going to end up happening is it's going to allow us to create URL endpoints for our Lambda functions. Okay, and when I first saw it, it didn't make a ton of sense to me either. What I'm really suggesting is if I go into Lambda and I have these functions, right, and we've looked at how do we build these Lambda functions. So we had the MATC hello world where we're connecting to Dynamo and getting data. And then on Tuesday we looked at the triggers, and so if an S3 object got placed in the bucket, then we could run our trigger, or if something happened in Dynamo and we had our Dynamo stream enabled, then we could trigger kind of a before and after snapshot. All of these things, so the hello world, we were able to create a test event and basically get our Dynamo data out. All of these things work within the AWS ecosystem. So if I happen to be using S3 for storage and I happen to be using DynamoDB for my database, then I can trigger my Lambda functions. But that's the only way we've been able to do it so far. What if I want to write a JavaScript application to access my Lambda function? What if I want to write a Java application that's going to access my Lambda function? And I don't want to use AWS. Then I have a problem. So API Gateway is the tool that allows us to open up these Lambda functions through URL endpoints. So basically I can say publish this out to the web, publish this function out to the web. That's what API Gateway allows me to do. Okay, and there's some complexity with that. Okay, the other thing I want to point out, and it's fairly relevant, just to kind of give you an idea of how powerful Lambda is. So the lab. I know a few of you have completed the lab, a few of you are still working on the lab, some of you haven't looked at the lab. There's a lab where we're resizing thumbnails, and the code that I gave you is in Python. And my guess is, I don't know Python. My guess is that you don't know Python. But it doesn't matter. Right? So I have a Python function, and normally I'm so used to writing, like I have a Java application, or I have a .NET application, or I have a JavaScript application, or Python, or PHP. I have an application that's written in a specific language. What Lambda does is it allows us to write functions. So for instance, let's say my application needs to resize images. I can hire a developer that knows Lambda that can resize images, and I don't care what programming language they work in. I have a function written in Lambda that's going to resize my images. I don't care that it's written in Python. Makes no difference to me. It'll work. So I have this function defined. I don't care what programming language it's in. My application needs that particular component. I can just plug it into my application. It's kind of like Lego pieces building your application. Yeah?
Does that mean that the given programming language is essentially wrapped in a common container of sorts?
Kinda. Yes, I have this function, I can trigger it. Like, from here, like I know it says the runtime. Does it matter what the runtime is as long as it produces the results that I want? So given an image, you resize it? I don't care. Right, or given a video, you convert it to whatever format I need, or if I upload a video, you put it on YouTube, and right? So whatever service I want to build, like you don't care what programming language it's in. So now we're writing codes as services, essentially. Yeah?
When does the programming language chosen become a concern?
So right now, these are really just kind of functions. Mm-hmm. At some point, I have to architect a whole application, and it might be a mishmash of Lambda functions. So at some point, I have to have a container that's going to organize my application. Like that would be the choice. Like all these services are available to me, and I'm going to pick and choose what I need, where I need to apply it, but at some point I need a language that does that. Okay, so let's take a look at API Gateway first, and then we're going to come back to Lambda, and we'll set up a API Gateway endpoint. And there's lots of ways to do this, so we can kind of go both directions. So in API Gateway, I can say I'm creating an API that's going to use these Lambda functions, or from a Lambda function, I can say build an API Gateway for this function. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean. So I'm just going to go to my console, and I'm going to API Gateway. And right now, I do not have any gateways in this region. Okay. So I can have a WebSocket API, a REST API that's private, or an HTTP API. I've always used these REST APIs. Okay, but I think the push is to move over to HTTP APIs, but again, doesn't necessarily matter all that much. I think we'll see what we need when I try to just build a RESTful API. So REST, it's going to be a new API. I have to name it. So here's going to be my MATC demo API. I can give it a description, demo for cloud for developers. And then I'm going to create the API. This is the interface for dealing with API Gateway. Okay, and like I said, dealing with API Gateway requires a lot of background knowledge. So I always think of like your students, you're in the degree program and you're seeing stuff maybe for the first time, and you'll start to lose context like, I don't really know how to deal with the terminal or the console or whatever, right? And then 2 years from now, you'll look at the AWS CLI again, and you'll have maybe ran into the command prompt or the terminal window, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense now. That's what we were doing in class. So a lot of times, like, these gaps don't get filled in real time. Like, hey, I don't know how to use the command line, or I'm really worried about working on the terminal or command line. And now 2 years later, you've, took a class or at some point had to figure it out. And now you're like, oh yeah, I know how to do it now. Now the AWS CLI examples make sense. Okay, so a lot of this is kind of like you see it once and then you circle around the problem until you finally have the problem come into focus. Okay, so I'm looking at API Gateway, and there's all sorts of stuff here. So what this does is basically I can create methods and resources. That's the big thing. So my method is going to be attached to my URL. So for instance, for this MATC demo, I might want to be able to get students. Like I'm dealing with students. So I could create a method, a resource, not a method, called students. Right, so this is my MATC demo. I care about students. I might also care about courses. I want to delete that resource. So where I'm at in this tree view is going to dictate where these resources get created. So if I'm saying the root of my website is just MATC, it's my MATC demo, then I care about students, but then I also might care about courses. So I'm going back to the root. I'm going to create another resource saying this is all the info I have for courses. So I could have another URL going to courses. I could have another URL going to activities. And then I can have sub-URLs underneath here. So I could say, I only care about spring, summer, fall courses. So I could have a spring, summer, fall part of the URL. What these are all endpoints. So I can basically say, for this resource, I want to map it to a particular Lambda function. Okay, and you'll see I'm clicking on activities, I'm clicking on courses, I'm clicking on students. You notice there's not anything on the right-hand side that's going to allow me to do that. Okay, so again, I told you there's more background information on this. So what's going to happen is this is a web-based endpoint, an HTTP endpoint, a RESTful API. Okay, with RESTful APIs, these are going to be my URLs. But then to access those URLs, I can access those URLs with any different HTTP verb. So I could use a get, a post, a put, a delete, or any, or options are the different HTTP verbs that are going to show up in API Gateway. So let's say I wanted to do something with courses and I wanted to show you a list of all my courses. If I'm going to show you a list of all my courses, again, background knowledge here, an API endpoint, if I want a list of all the courses, I'm going to do that with an HTTP GET. I'm saying, get me those courses. Okay, as opposed to if I wanted to insert a new course, I'd be posting to that URL, posting the new course information. Or if I wanted to remove a course, I'd be using an HTTP delete. So I have all those HTTP verbs that could position me or run my HTTP traffic to those endpoints. Okay, so if I'm just going to go ahead and open up Atom. If I say my endpoint is /students, I could arrive there at that endpoint by using a get, a post, a put, a delete, or options, or any. Those are the different HTTP verbs that could make a request to that endpoint. I still end up in the same place. I just end up there differently. Okay, and the analogy I like to use is, let's say we were going to go to Chicago. Right, we had a flight out of Chicago because we're going to the Bahamas or something like that. Get out of Wisconsin in the winter. I could drive there. Right, I could take a bus. I could probably take a train. I could fly. I could have a connecting flight. All different ways to arrive in Chicago, right? Same with all different ways to arrive at that HTTP endpoint. They're different, right? How I actually get to the O'Hare Airport is going to be different if I drive my car versus take a train versus have a connecting flight. It gets different, but I end up at the same location. Same thing with these HTTP verbs. They're different, but I end up at the same location. Okay, so as far as API gateway is concerned, that's different, how I get there. So we're talking about courses and how I get there. The methods are how I get there. So if I say create a method, now I have my options. Like which HTTP verb took me to courses. So if I just want to read a list of courses, I'm going to define it as an HTTP GET. And then I'm going to say OK. Okay, now you'll notice on the right-hand side, I start to actually get some stuff that I can configure that makes some sense. So I can... for the most part, I'm dealing with Lambda functions, okay, for the most part. And then I can define which function. So I think our MATC hello world, I think I'm on US East 1, aren't I? No, I'm on US East 2. Okay, so that's my Lambda function that I want to trigger. I'm going to hit save, and then I get another screen to configure this. It says you're about to give permission for your Lambda function to be invoked from API Gateway. Okay, and when I get to this point, I'm basically saying if I go to this course's URL via an HTTP GET, this is the request response pipeline. So in the method request, this is the first stopping point along the way. I always think of it like a filter or like water running down a stream, right? You hit the first dam. This is the first dam, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Okay, so a couple things that are going on here. I can configure things within each of these different stopping points along the way for the request response pipeline. Okay, so with the method request, I might define what are my URL query string parameters or my request headers that I'm looking for. If I'm validating this, if I require an API key, or do I turn you away right here? Okay, so maybe in order to access the courses, you have to provide an API key that I supply for you. If you don't, I'm going to stop you right here. I'm not going to go any further. It doesn't matter. You didn't provide the API key, I'm going to give you an error saying you're not authorized. Okay, assuming that I pass through that method request, So assuming I've gotten that far, that I've passed the API key, and I haven't even set that up yet, then I'm going to get over to the integration request. And what it allows us to do, where this usually comes into play, is it basically says the user's going to pass some data. So maybe I only want courses for the IT department. Or maybe I want courses that are offered online at a specific campus or taught by a specific instructor. Right? So I'm going to give you information about the course and I want to filter it down. So the client has sent me the request and they said, I only want to see online courses. What happens is in these mapping templates, I basically define like, here's how I want that incoming parameter mapped to my Lambda function. This is how my Lambda function is going to get access to that data. Okay, so you might have passed it as course ID, but my Lambda function is just expecting it as an ID, so I can map course ID that you passed as a client to ID, which is what my function expects. That's what that mapping template is. There's a whole programming language about these mapping templates. It's the Apache Velocity templating language. So basically, there's a whole language that defines how I map incoming parameters. So don't worry about it too much. We'll eventually see it within API Gateway. But again, I passed some data, and now I've mapped it the way I need it. I head back up. It eventually gets to my Lambda function. So my Lambda function has an event argument that comes in. So remember I told you you could pass in a course ID. I can map it to an ID. The event object can then have an ID attribute that I could pull out and use within my Lambda function. Then method response and integration response. So the method response is going to have all of our headers. So right now, this isn't set up very well. I'll show you a different way to set it up, I think. It's going to have our HTTP headers, and then the integration response can actually supply those headers. So basically, the method response has to say what are acceptable HTTP headers that I can send to the client, and then the integration response says, yep, you said I need to know all of this information for the cross-origin resource sharing, so CORS is kind of a big one. Then I can come in here and plug those values in these header mappings. Okay, and just like we had on the integration request, I have a mapping template for the integration response. So the incoming data I can reformat. So you sent it in as course ID, I need it as ID. I return it as a course. You don't need it as a course, you need it as some other format. Okay, so I can reformat everything coming in and out of my function. So it gets really complicated, right? And this is just for one way to access that URL. Okay? I'll show you a built-out example. So I use API Gateway for the Advanced JavaScript Project 3. I'm running it on US East 1. It's fairly simple. Okay, so there's this to-do API. And the way this works is at the root URL, I have a HTML file that kind of describes the API. And then I have options for delete, get, and post. And then I have this expression to tell me which student ID so I can get information. So let's say I go to get. This is the big one. So essentially what ends up happening is you type in a URL with your student ID attached to it, and I give you all the tasks that belong to your student ID. Like that's how that works. Okay, so if I look at the method request, I do require an API key. And then if I look at the request, sorry, I don't know if I have it in the URL parameters. I must not. I think I moved it. But you'll notice I have a mapping template where I say that I'm going to have an object called student that's coming through as the parameters. This is the template language. So that my Lambda function is then going to have access to a student object. It's your student ID. That I then take your student ID and send it over to DynamoDB and pull the tasks based on your student ID. And then we're eventually going to get that data. We're going to get all your tasks given a student ID. The integration response, this is usually set up after the method response. So the method response, if I look at this status, because I want you to be able to call my API gateway from anywhere, there's this access control, allow origin. What that does is it allows me to say that I will allow the request coming from anywhere. Otherwise, it has to be on the same server, is what the cross-origin resource sharing is. So I'm showing you a bunch of stuff. And again, it's probably like, I don't understand that. I'm not going to be coding that yet. You will eventually be coding this, but don't worry so much now. Just know that this is kind of the request response pipeline. A request comes in, it hits the method request, then the integration request, then the actual function, and then you have a couple of other opportunities before you send it actually back to the client. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, it does. So creating resources are basically URL endpoints. So like I don't want all of my student data, like I don't want all of MATC's data mixed together, so I'll create different endpoints for students, for courses, for resources, for activities. So that's what I'm using resources for, is it's just another URL within your project. If that makes sense. Stages are kind of interesting. So I have a stage called tasks. What staging is it allows us to kind of move our code from development to demo to production. I use the stage called tasks. This is a little bit of kind of an advanced skill, I would suggest. So I'll show you what I mean by this. Let's say I go back to my API. Actually, I want to be on the stages. And I want to invoke this URL. Why am I getting forbidden? I'm getting forbidden because I don't have my API key embedded in here anymore. I think I have it in Postman. I was just playing around with it the other day, so I think I still have it in Postman. So if I look at my headers, you can see I have this API key that's required. I can send the request. It's taking a second. And eventually, I'm going to get my student information. Okay, this is just the data that's coming back from DynamoDB for this API endpoint. Okay, so I'm doing an HTTP GET, saying I want all of the tasks for this given student ID. That's the URL I'm using, and it's bringing back my particular data, my particular set of tasks. And there happens to be an API key associated with it. I'm doing this with an HTTP GET. There's also, at the same endpoint, tasks, I could be doing a post, and I can insert a new record. Or I could be doing a delete and deleting a record. Okay? All at the same endpoint. I think showing you this is more complicated than it needs to be, but I just want to be clear, like, this is our starting point. Let's just go, so stages, in my particular example, what happens with my stages is that becomes part of the URL. So your stage name becomes part of your URL. So most people will use that as like development, demo, production. I'm using it to say that this is a particular endpoint called tasks. And I don't have other stuff in there. So I don't have students and courses and activities. I just have one endpoint, which is tasks. So I'm kind of faking it so I get a prettier URL. Okay, authorizers allows me to basically set up AWS Cognito pools to validate that this is a valid user. I haven't used gateway responses and customized them. Models will allow me to define like what should be coming in, what should be going out. Like I'm expecting a course, then here's the format. So it's kind of doing data validation for you, incoming and outgoing is what a model will allow us to do. Usage plans are kind of interesting. So basically I can say, you know, I get a million API gateway requests per month that I don't have to pay for. Okay, so you're not going to pay for anything in API gateway, but I can set up a usage plan to say, look, this is the free tier. This is when I start charging people to use my API, and I can have different levels of payment. So my basic usage plan eventually says that I can configure throttling so that you can see 10 requests per second, 1,000 requests per month. So that's the usage plan. The API keys, I told you I set up API keys for my API. It's tied to the basic usage plan. Right? Okay, so I think this is a lot to digest, right? Like API gateway, there's a lot of background information in order for this to function correctly. I want to show you the easy way to this. Okay? So I'm going to close API gateway. And I have my MATC hello world function, right? And I can't even remember what it does, so I'm going to just test it to see what it does. Eventually I get results, and it looks like I'm getting back an empty array. I can't remember what the code was. That's probably not a very good function to use, so let me create a new function. I'm going to create a new function from scratch called API gateway demo. Okay, so we have our code, which is not all that interesting, but hello from Lambda, Cubs stink. Right, this is my function. I can test it, so I want to create a new test event. It doesn't matter what my key value pairs are because I'm not using them, so just an empty object is fine. I'm going to create this test called API demo test. And then I'm going to test this. And you'll see that it succeeds and I get my message. This is my response back from this method. Okay, so not anything new. We could use whatever language we want, doesn't matter. But we have our function defined, and we just edited it in line. It doesn't matter how we edit it. We have this function. I want to make this function available over the internet. So right now it's tied to the AWS ecosystem. I want to break it out of the AWS ecosystem. Okay, in order to do that, I'm going to say add a trigger. The first trigger that comes up is API gateway. I get to pick an API, so I could say the MATC demo API, or I can have it create a new API within API gateway for me. So I'm choosing that, a new API. I'm going to choose REST API because that's what we were just looking at, as opposed to the beta version of HTTP API. So security I'm going to make open. If I go into additional settings, this ends up being important. This course and it's not set up automatically. I have to manually go set this up. I'm going to show you an easier way to do this, I think. So I know some of you are in my Ajax class right now and you might want to hit your API gateway. You won't be able to unless CORS is enabled. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of that. I'm going to add the trigger again. It's an API gateway trigger, but this time I'm going to choose create a new API with HTTP API. So just a different setting. It's open security. And then here I can enable CORS right here. And what CORS stands for is cross-origin resource sharing. Meaning, if everything came from the same domain name, everything works fine. No problem. But here's where I run into problems is, let's say I have an API that was built by one company that's on one domain, and now I have a client that wants to connect to it from another domain. That's not going to happen unless the API says it's okay by enabling cross-origin resource sharing. That's what CORS is. Okay, so I'm going to add the API. And now you'll notice what ends up happening is, let's go over to API Gateway. So I'm opening that in a new browser tab. Now you'll notice that I have this new API Gateway demo API created by Lambda. If I click on that, you can see these stages. I always like to think I can just click on these stages. You'll see I can't. I get an internal server error. But if I go at this from a different way, which is Lambda, so you'll notice the way it's set up is I have a default stage, and then my API name is API Gateway Demo. And now you'll notice that as I'm hitting that particular URL that's just hosted for me on Amazon, it's going to run my Lambda function, and that code's going to be available to me. That response is available to me. So it's fairly easy to set up an API gateway from Lambda. Fairly easy, but then if I want to build out a whole API, then it gets way more complicated. Right, so right now this is just for any way that I end up at the API Gateway demo URL, then any HTTP method is going to get the same response. I can change it to say only HTTP gets. Okay, and that doesn't affect my application at all because I'm doing an HTTP GET when I type in a browser URL, right? If I tie it to a post, so if instead I say edit this, and the only way you can get that data is if you do an HTTP post, and I save it, now it's broken. Because when I go to a browser and I type in the URL, I'm doing an HTTP GET to get to that URL, so I'm driving a bus as opposed to taking my car now. Right? I've arrived at this destination in a different way. I'm doing a GET, but the only thing that that API gateway is responding to is a post. So now you'll notice I'm getting an internal server error. It doesn't respond to posts. I can generate a post. So if I take this URL, I'm just going to copy it to my clipboard, and I come back over to Postman, which is just a developer tool that you can download from Chrome. It's a Chrome app. I say that I want to do a post to this particular URL. I can send it, and you'll notice the response I'm getting, hello from Lambda, Cub Stink. So if I access it via a post, it works great. If I try to access it via a GET, it's not going to work. I get an internal server error, even though it's the same URL. So it depends on how I end up at that endpoint. The way my API gateway function set up is I'm only going to respond to a post. I screwed that up. I haven't used the new beta version of the HTTP API. I'm more comfortable with the RESTful API, but some things are easier in here and some things are harder. Like this is not what I wanted. I wanted the GET under the API gateway. I wonder if I do a get like that. I spelled it wrong. One more try. Let me delete it. I want to create a new forget. And I want it to show up under the same URL. Then I can configure it. I can attach an integration. So it's a Lambda function. Or I can create and attach. This look is different. I can also manage those integrations to say this is the one. It's tied to this Lambda function on US East 2. What's the timeout? This service becomes super important. I love writing code in Lambda. I love the fact that I can write in Java, .NET, Python, JavaScript, C#. It doesn't matter what language I write. I create a function that's going to be important for my application, so kind of a building block that I can reuse. I can have all sorts of like utility functions, like resizing images or uploading images or deleting images and stuff like that. And then I can use all those different component pieces to build out an application. But the only way I can do that is if those functions are accessible over the internet. So if I decide I want to build a client application and I don't want to host it on AWS, I need to be able to access those functions. The only way I can access those functions is through API Gateway. That's it. So if I want to get all the students out of a DynamoDB database, I hit a Lambda function, but the only way I can hit the Lambda function is to go through API Gateway. That's what API Gateway allows us to do. We're going to spend some time here. I know it's complicated. So I think the easiest way to get started with API Gateway is just to create a trigger and see what the URL looks like. And kind of play around with those settings because it builds out the API for you for that one method call for that one function. Okay, if we go back to I want to be on API Gateway. If we go back to US East 1, and I'm looking at my to-do API, I really have four methods, if you will. So delete, which allows me to delete a task. Post, which allows me to insert a task. Get, which basically reads an HTML file and sends HTML. Like it's a description of the service, and I put that on the other day, and like I just threw up an HTML page to make sure it worked. And then I have a get, which will give me all the tasks for a particular student. So I really have three different services: delete, insert, and read. That's what the API does. And if I look back over my services, so I'm going to go back to Lambda, but I'm going to go to US East 1 this time. Here's the four functions that are attached to that API. And if you look, it's just code that goes out to DynamoDB and says, okay, here's the table. Here's the key condition expression, student ID equal to ID. I take the student and I get the data. That's how I get all the tasks. That's what I'm returning. That's the all tasks function. If I go back to the delete task, so given a student ID and a task description, I can delete the task. So you'll see I get that delete item passing in the params. If I go to the add, so I get the item from the event body. It's mapped in the API Gateway. So we're passing information in about a new task. I insert the item, so my params are the table and then the new item, and then I put that new item in. And I get confirmation of it. So my service has 3 different pieces of functionality: insert, delete, and select. I have them mapped to all different API gateway endpoints. So you can invoke any one of those functions. If you want to see the HTML one, that's kind of interesting, I think. The service description. So I read from the file system an HTML file and return the contents of the file. And then I have my HTML file that's sitting right here. It's nothing. It's really just an HTML page. So my Lambda function is serving up an HTML page that I then make available through API Gateway. This is kind of unique. It's kind of strange to be able to do with an API, but I think it's useful. But it's just Node.js code. Read a file and send the contents out. Okay, so I'm thinking we probably have about 2 weeks in API Gateway, and then we'll have the exam. So next Tuesday, Thursday, the following Tuesday, Thursday, then the exam. And I don't know, it's probably falling close to spring break, because spring break's right in the middle of the semester. If it is, we'll kind of work around it. I'll give you an exact date next Tuesday. Okay. I'm going to make it online, so you can take it. You can take it multiple times. Again, I don't know how to test you in this class, so you're kind of guinea pig, so you kind of get a free pass on the exam. So what I'd suggest to you is don't worry about it too much. I have to test you, but I'll make it so that you can retake it and take the highest score you get. But again, you're guinea pig, so like, it might be a mess, but like, I'm pretty confident you all do fine on the exam.
What type of layout is it?
Multiple choice, true, false.
Okay.
Yeah. Which makes it hard, too, for a class like this, where everything's online.
No essay?
No essays. So.